will turn it over to you now, my friend.
Good morning, everyone. Today is June 9th, 2022, and welcome to the New Possibility Report, the Will Work for Food project, founded by Natalie Armstrong Motan in the spring of 2020. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler and I are proud to co-host this program along with Natalie and Sarah Agamiri, bringing you fascinating webinars on mediation, negotiation, and communications topics generally. Today, we're very proud and very happy to have Grande Lum as our guest speaker. Grande is the Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Menlo College in Atherton, California. Prior to joining Menlo, he was Director of the Divided Community Project at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Previously, Grande was nominated by President Obama and confirmed by the Senate as Director of the Community Relations Service. We're going to hear much more about that today, an agency within the Department of Justice. Before joining CRS, Grande was clinical professor at UC Hastings School of Law, where he directed the Center for Negotiation and Dispute Resolution. His latest book, see it right here, America's Peacemakers, the Community Relations Service and Civil Rights, published by the University of Missouri Press with Bertram Levine. He won the 2020 International Institute for Conflict Resolution Outstanding Book Award. He's also the author of the Negotiation Field Book, 2010, Tear Down the Wall, Be Your Own Mediator in Conflict, Optimality Press, 2013. And he has an extraordinary educational background. He has a bachelor's degree from UC Berkeley and a law degree from Harvard. And Grande, I know it's just, how can you possibly top that, right? So there's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask people to contribute to a food bank if they like what they see. And our audiences have been so very generous in contributing to fight food insecurity worldwide. One of my favorite parts of the webinar each week is when we announce the running total of just how much our audiences have contributed. Jean, I believe you're going to do the honors. Unmute yourself.
Yes. Trying to get that unmuted real fast there. Well, we are at an amazing number, especially looking back at where we've been and how far we've come. $286,225.90 of donations to food banks around the world, of which we know. So you know that number is well over 300,000, but we can't wait to get to the $300,000 mark and pass it, that of people making donations that they have told us about. So thank you so much, and please keep them coming, and let Natalie or one of us know, and we'll add it to the total. Thank you.
That's incredible generosity. Thank you all so much for those contributions. Now, Grande, we'd love to hear from you about the food bank that's important to you, where you'd like people to direct contributions if they're able to do so. And then to talk about your book, America's Peacemakers, and the agency that you headed in the Department of Justice. Grande, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I do want to mention, Jeff and I worked together at the Department of Justice more decades ago than I care to admit. We did the mediation advocacy program at Charleston, South Carolina. That was the first time I met Jeff, I think, many, many years ago. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Natalie. This is a terrific program. I am so proud and privileged to be a part of it. I'm glad to hear you're so close to $300,000. I hope today helps move it in that regard. So the food bank that I've selected is Second Harvest Food Bank in Silicon Valley, which is a terrific food bank here that covers Santa Clara County and San Mateo County, where I live. It has over 300, it's a network of over 300 partners, and they have 900 sites in Santa Clara and San Mateo. I actually have a very personal connection, a board member at Menlo. Kathleen ran the Second Harvest Food Bank, and we have several employees here at Menlo who used to work at Second Harvest as well. So I have a very strong connection, incredibly impressed by what they do in terms of food concerns here in the San Francisco Bay Area, particularly the peninsula. I think in the chat you have the link to Second Harvest, so please do donate if you so choose. So very much thank you for that.
Go for it, Graham.
I should okay. I will go for it. I didn't know there was an official from that. By the way, thank you all for showing up. It's great to see a few familiar faces here, and a few folks that I don't know. So it is terrific to see Robin and Charles here today. I'm so happy that you guys join us, and everybody for coming in. My plan is to just, I think, talk a bit about the book for 20 minutes, and I think Jeff and G may have some questions, and absolutely welcome questions from folks as well here. So this, I want to start by saying, and then I'm going to move to show a few slides as well, just to give you a sense of it. But I was the director of the Community Relations Service from 2012 to 2016. And it was really the honor of my life. The book itself, I had actually originally planned to have it written by 2014, the 50th anniversary of CRS. So it was about 6 years late. It took a bit of time, but I'm very proud of it here. So why don't I go ahead and share the slide here. And so, as Jeff mentioned, this book was originally written actually in 2004, the first edition by Bertram Levine. And I think I want to absolutely acknowledge that. I never met Bertram. He had passed away soon after he finished writing this book, actually. And he had served many roles at CRS. He'd worked there for a good 20 plus years, beginning in the 1960s. And this is the quote that is at the beginning of the book. It is, I think, is important to recognize that this is by the Honorable John Lewis, who many of you know as really the moral conscience, I think, of the House and of the Congress and of this country. And he often talked about good trouble, right? We know him for his protests, how many times he was arrested for, but he also spoke at several anniversaries and was very involved in one of CRS's first major mediations in Selma. And I like starting with it because it is at the tension of the importance of peace, the importance of resolution, but also the importance of protest, the importance of challenging the country in a patriotic way to make it the country that it promises to be. And so I like to start with that and how he felt that CRS really helped cool the tensions of a nation, and how important it was and still is today. This is a photo that and I'm just going to share a few photos. I think it just sort of captures the time. This is a book that covers more than 50 years of the history of CRS. This was from Birmingham in 1963, when basically, and it's really a high point of the civil rights movement in that this was really about Black empowerment. This is when, of course, Bull Connor unleashes dogs and fire hoses on the people of Birmingham, and the photos traveled around the world. It is always notable, and I'll be talking about a number of huge civil rights events from the last 50 years, about how important media, how important photography is and videos are in giving visual and proof even of what was going on here. What we often, and I share this one because it actually helped lead to the creation of CRS. Burke Marshall, who is the Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Rights Division, basically mediated between the then all-white government of Birmingham with the community leaders, with Black leaders in Birmingham, to basically end that and basically end segregation in Birmingham, even though George Wallace was the governor at the time, and it was the rule of the land. What he said, what Burke Marshall said was, this took a lot of work for, and he said, it took away time from litigation, and he thought it was incredibly important to set up a separate arm to focus on mediation. The other piece of it that leads the signing and the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the creation of CRS. CRS is within Title 10 of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, is that Lyndon Baines Johnson, the president at that time, was the person who first proposed it. He had Arthur Goldberg, who was later a Supreme Court justice, write the legislation based on, and I know we've had a few folks who have been federal employees here, based on the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service. So that's what the Community Relations Service was based upon here. This is July 2nd, 1964. Interestingly, Robert F. Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at the time, was concerned about violence and confrontations right when the signing of the Civil Rights Act. Interesting, LBJ only talks about CRS on July 2nd because at that point they were concerned about July 4th, what would happen around the country. It was largely peaceful at that time, but CRS was immediately deployed at that time. The first major work that CRS gets involved in is Selma. This is March 7th, 1965, becomes known as Bloody Sunday. John Lewis, who I mentioned early, is the person in the light trench coat there in front. And this is another iconic photograph of that day. And many people end up in the hospital that day. And John Lewis gets his skull fractured on this day. LBJ gets incredibly upset, as does the country, and sends Leroy Collins, who's the director of CRS, to make sure that there wasn't any further violence, but that the group could continue, that the protesters could march peacefully, could exercise their First Amendment right of free speech. And that's what Leroy Collins and the CRS team do. There were 3 crossings. I'm not going to go in. This is an incredible story. I'm just going to touch really the high level facts on it. I really do commend you to read the book. I'll put it into the chat a little bit later, but you can get it from Missouri Press as well. And there's I'll put a link to it there at a 35% discount. It's www.americaspeacemakers.org. But there's a link and a code to do that. But it's I think it was a chapter written originally by Bertram Levine, and it's a stunning story about how mediation really saved lives and really changed the course of history here. If those of you who are familiar with the event or even seen the recent movie Selma, there's a part where Martin Luther King leads the protesters across the Pettus Bridge, and at the middle of the bridge stops, and they sing "We Shall Overcome," and there's a concern for this is in the second crossing, and there's going to be another conflict. But Leroy Collins and CRS had mediated between Andrew Young, who's also pictured here, and with the Alabama State Trooper Colonel Lingo, and they actually make an agreement that they would be able to pass peacefully. And so that really prevents any further violence. So what Leroy Collins, who's the director, who's pictured here as well, says there was a flowing, there was a lot of tears, but no blood on that day. Leroy Collins had been the governor of Florida before he became the first director of CRS. He later runs for Senate. This picture is used against him, and when he runs for Senate, and he largely says this picture was what caused him to lose the election because he had gotten ahead of the Florida citizens. He never regretted it. But this was widely used and widely put up that he was a protester, even though he was there as a leader of the Community Relations Service. I don't know how you may remember Frank Collin, but he was a leader of an American Nazi group in the 1970s. And it was a very small group. We've certainly seen a resurgence of white nationalism in this country. This happened in Chicago, and he had wanted to protest in Chicago in front of the federal building. He's denied that. He then sends letters to suburbs around Chicago. Only Skokie's city manager responds, Skokie, Illinois. And just because the city manager responds, Frank Collin decides that they want to go rally in Skokie. And many of you who are lawyers in this setting may be aware of the Supreme Court case of Skokie here, and that was the case here. Dick Salem was a mediator for the Community Relations Service. Some of you may be familiar with him. He was very active in the informing of ACR, the Association for Conflict Resolution, wrote a book with Nancy Rogers on mediation as well. Nancy Rogers, who is the Dean of Ohio State Law School and a colleague of mine at the Divided Community Project. And it's a situation where the ACLU is, of course, involved. And there was going to be a huge protest, and nobody wanted to speak like today, to a Nazi, and made a huge difference in preventing violence. That there was thoughts that there was going to be a lot of violence in Skokie, and because of CRS's involvement, the rally does not happen. He actually gets Frank Collin to basically agree to give up, even though he won the right. He does eventually protest in Chicago, and of course does win the right of free speech here. For those of you old enough, I was, to remember the Boston Public Schools desegregation in the 1970s. I remember I was in San Francisco when this was happening. I was in schools, and I certainly remember the challenges that were there. But Boston was the one that captured the country's headlines and concerns at the time when they were trying to integrate the schools that were then mostly black and white. It's very different today in terms of ethnicities and backgrounds, but then it was primarily black and white. And CRS is called in to work on this. One of the first mediators, who's a woman, Silka Hansen, played a lead role here, and really helped keep folks safe, helped create a Black-White Parents Council in the Boston Public Schools, and plays a huge role in that. I'm talking a lot about the incidents that we're familiar with, and more of the immediate help that comes in, on the ground. I do want to say there's a larger picture as well. After Boston happens, schools across the country become hugely concerned about what they're going to do. CRS plays a role and goes to Detroit, goes to other cities, works with school districts throughout the country, and there are conferences, and they really try to figure out, they don't want to be the next Boston, was what they were talking about in that case. And it does largely become much more peaceful in terms of the integration. Now, there are still challenges today in terms of how racially segregated our public schools are. But there is the work that happens on the ground, and there's also how do we then learn from each situation to apply to other ones. As you know, there's been a rise in anti-Asian hate issues throughout the country that has been going on. It has touched me personally. I was born the neighborhood that I was born and raised in San Francisco. There was a killing of a person a block from my house, of an 87-year-old Thai man, just a few months ago. So it's something that is certainly, I have a lot of sensitivity around. I remember my father having a gun to his head at our house, growing up, for example. These issues are not new. I mean, a lot of these issues that we're talking about are not new. This is from 1982. This was Vincent Shin, who was killed by two unemployed auto workers who, of course, who mistaken him for Japanese, and kill him at his bachelor's party, where they're gathered here. CRS plays a role in working with Vincent Shin's mother, who's pictured here, in then working with the Department of Justice. It is one of the first times where the Hate, Violence, Civil Rights Act is used, that existed at that time for Asian Americans, in this case. But it was really a role, akin to making sure that what resources are available, what can be done here. Some of you may remember this from 1999, November 21st, when Elian Gonzalez is rescued at sea during the Thanksgiving week. Interestingly enough, the Coast Guard picked him up. Actually, the fisherman who picked him up is actually the one holding Elian in this picture. And at the time, the Community Relations Service, the agency, he should have been turned over to CRS because they had the jurisdiction for refugees, children. But the Coast Guard decides to turn Elian over to his family members in Miami because it's Thanksgiving, which changes the course of history as well. Because if he stays with CRS and is then returned to Cuba to his father, it changes things. But this becomes huge for those of you who remember on CNN and all that. The Cuban American community is totally activated. CRS plays a huge role in trying to bring back, in trying to come to a peaceful end on this situation. Janet Reno, of course, was the Attorney General at the time. Something to remember is there had been the Waco incident, the Branch Davidian issue that Reno took, which was a situation where unfortunately lives passed. And I think that my sense is that it affected how she wanted to handle the Elian Gonzalez case. Several mediation attempts were made. I detail them in the book here. It's the first time it's ever been told, really, and I'm very proud of this one to get out at what happened. What was interesting is some of the mediators, they knew Janet Reno really, really well. They were community leaders from Miami, but they miscommunicated. They thought Janet Reno was the negotiator. She thought of herself as the mediator. She had been trained by Carrie Menkel-Metal, one of our colleagues, of course, in mediation. It's really interesting how this turned out. It is quite possible that this might have turned differently. It was so hard for the family because of the politics to turn Elian over, but there were several attempts and it was close. At the same time, CRS was very focused on keeping the peace in Miami, and there was a lot of protests, there was a lot of animosity. Going back to the danger of doing this work, the mediator, Thomas Battles, had to go into hiding because there were a number of death threats for just mediating the situation as well. So, and it's not as true today, but certainly in the 60s when CRS mediators went into certain places, especially in the South, especially in rural areas, it was quite dangerous. Or in urban urban protest situations, folks would have a gun sometimes pointed by U.S. military or police. A Black mediator, Roger Wilkins, who's a director of CRS, one of the highest ranking Black officials in the LBJ administration, for example, when he went into Watts, if police officers or military were there, they would consider him someone of dangerous, even though he was wearing a suit and he had to show his DOJ or his IDs in order for folks to drop their guns. So there was always a bit of danger involved here. Trayvon Martin, this was in April 2012. This is when I was on seat as director of CRS. As many of you may remember, he is visiting his father in Sanford, Florida, and he is returning to the condo where his father and his father's girlfriend are living. He went out and bought some Skittles and an Arizona tea drink, and is accosted by a wannabe neighborhood watch guy, George Zimmerman. This becomes the interplay of someone who absolutely wrongly thinks that Trayvon was up to no good, and against what the 9/11 operator tells him, decides to confront Trayvon. And as we know, it's tragedy unfolds where George Zimmerman, who has a gun on him, shoots Trayvon, and claims, because of Florida is the first state to pass the stand your ground law, it plays an important role in then him being found innocent in that situation. CRS plays a huge role in working with the family, in working with the city. There were dozens and dozens of protests in working with the protesters to exercise the First Amendment right, to working with the city. And it was Mayor Jeff Triplett, who was then the mayor of Sanford, credits CRS for helping the city maintain the peace. They had no idea how to deal at that time with the National Action Network led by Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson. This makes a huge difference in the ability for the city to actually even welcome the protesters. And CRS, also Thomas Battles, who's the mediator here, brings together Black and white pastors to help keep misinformation from happening as well in Sanford. I was also on seat during Ferguson after Michael Brown is shot. As you all know, there was for a number of days after Michael Brown is shot, there is turmoil in the streets. We were the first federal agency. I learned of the incident within hours of the shooting. The CRS is the first federal agency on the ground and working with the community there. It was a sign of how things had changed, right? Trayvon Martin was the most reported story in 2012, greater than the re-election of Barack Obama. And I sent conciliators, what we call conciliators, to Ferguson, and the conciliators I sent, I'll never forget this, said, they had been to these situations over, and I want to talk a little bit about that, and then I want to turn it over for questions. Is that for years, CRS had been working on these issues of law enforcement shootings of young Black and brown men, often, but often without the amount of, for decades, without the amount of publicity that they generate, right? So the Derek Dean, who goes to Ferguson, drives from Kansas City, thought that this would be like past ones, that there would be a candlelight vigil, some folks would show up, and that would be it, and he would return home to Kansas City. This was, as we all know, very, very different here. It becomes a very difficult decision for the Attorney General, then Eric Holder, to make a decision of whether to come to Ferguson. And he actually told me it was the most difficult decision he had to make while he was the Attorney General. When he makes a decision to come to Ferguson to see what they could do to calm things down, President Obama announces that the Community Relations Service is on the ground in Ferguson. Attorney General Holder asked me to organize, because we're the folks who know the community members in Ferguson, to organize several meetings for the Attorney General with the community, with local leaders, with faith leaders. So within 48 hours, we had to arrange a number of meetings, vet all the folks who are going to be there. And also really with the expectation that we could reduce the high degree of tension and create some peace within Ferguson and the greater area that day. I'll never forget it. I mean, it was such a lift for our team. Several other DOJ agencies were there, Civil Rights Division, U.S. Attorney, and we run the meetings. I facilitate a meeting with Attorney General Holder. And I will never forget what he said. He said, "I am the Attorney General of the United States, but I'm also a Black man." And he then shares stories from his youth of being stopped by police at the New Jersey Turnpike. It was hard for me to tell that day, what would happen that evening, but I still remember it very clearly. That was the first night in more than 12 nights that there was peace in the streets. There were very few people, and there were no arrests that night, and it made a difference. Now, I do want to say a little bit about the larger issue. CRS worked many years on these issues in the 80s, in the 70s. We certainly can remember Rodney King from the 1990s as well. What happened to him from the LA police. CRS had done use of force issues, had worked with police departments, and actually had tracked some reduction in fatalities over that time as well. So CRS has been doing that kind of work and doing it very well here. That is from the meeting in Ferguson where I facilitated, and Attorney General Holder spoke. This was from our 50th anniversary, and I think I like to sort of end here because the 1964 Civil Rights Act says that CRS conciliators have to do the work confidentially, like any mediator does. There's actually a clause there that says if you breach that confidentiality, you would pay a $1,000 fine. It hasn't gone up; it's still a $1,000 fine today. But 1 year in prison. I will say very thankfully and strongly that there's never been a CRS conciliator that has ever paid a $1,000 fine or gone to prison for a year. It also even says in Title 10 that CRS conciliators are not to seek publicity. This has all happened backstage. This has all happened behind the scenes. And so these people have worked really anonymously over this entire 58 years, basically here. And I think it's important. I think it's important to honor these folks. And when I wrote the book, I really just want to honor their work. I was a political. I was there for 4 years. But that was the important thing they did. One thing I want to mention, and I want to turn over to Jeff and to Jean, is that in 2009, the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act is passed, and that's the first time where CRS's jurisdiction is expanded beyond race. It then goes into gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, and disability. I was very proud to have worked on law enforcement treatment of transgender individuals. And it was the first video training ever created by a federal government on that issue. At a time, it's come a long way, and certainly, for example, gay marriage came a long way with when I was in the Obama administration in terms of how quickly that turned. But it was different at that time, even we're now talking 10 years ago on working on these types of issues. But it was one where I was very, again, changing with the times and adjusting to civil rights issues that exist for people of many different identities and from many different characteristics as well. So I want to thank everyone for listening and for inviting me to speak. It's something I'm very proud of and enjoy sharing because it is such an unknown agency for the most part, because that's the way it has to operate. Now, and I'll stop sharing as well.
Graham, thank you for a most fascinating, stimulating presentation. So we have one question in the chat. If someone were interested in becoming a conciliator, what would be your advice?
CRS, I want to say a couple things. What motivated me to get the book written, honestly, was during the Trump administration, there was a desire to zero out CRS, to eliminate CRS. So I wanted to get this book out there and unfortunately, after I left the agency, more than 50% of the personnel left. They retired, they went to other agencies, they left federal government. The good news is that there is now there was no director confirmed during the Trump administration, but Biden has confirmed a wonderful person who was the acting director, Paul Montero. He actually started 2 weeks ago. He was confirmed by the Senate 2 weeks ago, as a little bit more than that, but started 2 weeks ago, I should say. And he's terrific. He actually was the acting director after I left. He had actually worked in Standing Rock with some of the pipeline issues, for example. There's been a huge increase in budget, and there are a huge number of positions for CRS now available. So you went to USA Jobs and looked at Community Relations Service. There are a high number of positions there today. So I would certainly recommend anyone who's interested, or if you know anyone who's interested, to look at that as a way of doing it. There's a lot of actually Search for Common Ground, a group that many of you may be familiar with, an Alliance for Peace Building. A number of international peace groups are now focusing their work on domestically in the US as well. So there are other opportunities from some of these organizations to be doing this work. Neelan Parker, who is now the head of Search for Common Ground's US program, for example, and they have been hiring as well. The background for many changed over the years. Initially, in the 1960s, there weren't people with formal mediation, as I'm sure folks on this Zoom know. They were folks who had sometimes a human relations commissions background. There were folks with journalism backgrounds. There were attorneys who decided to do this work. Over time, that changes, and we have folks with civil rights backgrounds. There are a number of people now with mediation, dispute resolution backgrounds as well. What has made the agency really wonderful is people with varying backgrounds from federal government, from civil rights organizations, from law enforcement, from the military. That's what I think they bring what they can to it. And conciliation work, at least the way we defined it at CRS, included facilitation of dialogue, right? Facilitating groups. It could include mediation, and mediation could mean very formal mediations to create some sort of memo of understanding, or it could be what they used to call street mediation, right? You're just trying to keep folks apart in a protest and a rally. And I can share some really interesting stories about how we did that at Republican and Democratic national conventions, working with protest groups there as well. I'll just share one is, there would be some anarchist groups or groups that were just trying to create problems within totally peaceful, nonviolent protest groups. What some of the anarchist groups will do is that they'll try to start a fight, or they'll come into another protest group and try to just create chaos. What we would train them to do would be, we would actually create what are called like marshaling, self-marshaling. And you would train folks sometimes from a local church or local community group, sometimes different groups, and they would be marching along with protest groups, and they would be looking out for these sort of issues. And what they would do is, if they saw one of these anarchist groups, is to actually leave the middle, just all step back, and then leaving the anarchists so that there's nothing that they could, so making sure that they wouldn't be starting a fight at all. So there are all these things that you would then actually work with protest groups, work with law enforcement in order to make sure that nothing bad would happen by groups or individuals who are trying to create problems.
Brand, you must have had so many interesting experiences mediating yourself. I'm sure people would love to hear about your own skills and how you use them. Can you tell us about a situation where you were mediating where things looked really hopeless and terrible, and what you did?
Yeah.
What skills you drew upon to try to make things better?
Yeah, and prior to, and this may be helpful, and Jeff, you mentioned some of the background. I mean, prior to CRS, I had done a lot more labor management, collective bargaining, mediation. I had certainly done, some international diplomatic work. The one that, I got inspired to do this work, when Robin and I were in law school, I was a teaching fellow for Roger Fisher and Bruce Patton. And it was just really what inspired me partly was we had, as our students, folks who are from the South African government and from the African National Congress as they were trying to negotiate a new constitution post-apartheid, and we were training them. So that inspired me. It's like, wow, like this can be used in what seems to be a pretty intractable situation and really make a difference, that you could build individual. And we worked with Cyril Ramaphosa, who's now the president of South Africa, who's a labor negotiator. But what I learned there, and then I'll share a story or two, is that personal relationships do matter. That if you can create trust between folks, they do matter. So I'll share a story. While I was at CRS, I'm gonna hide some of the details for confidentiality purposes. It was a big city. It was a Black Lives Matter group. They were protesting. They had taken over a police department in front of the police department, not allowing folks to enter, and communication had totally broken down between the Black Lives Matter group and the mayor and the police chief. They were just not even talking to each other. And we played an incredibly important role in shuttle diplomacy. Like when things are that bad, somebody has to communicate or things can go really south, right? And there was they ultimately, and we had a team on the ground, right? So I'm a director. So most of the time, by the way, most of the work again goes to the staff themselves. But there are times when I come in, and they thought that having the director come in would make a difference. So I started talking to the mayor, the police chief, and to the Black Lives Matter group here, and it became clear that those in the protest group just wanted to be arrested. That was their goal, right? That was, and to the credit of the CRS team, they were just trying to figure out what they could do to create some sort of agreement. What became incredibly important was to figure out solutions that allowed, this was during the winter, there was snow, and there was concerns about, there was heaters brought out, and trying to make sure that whenever there was a sort of police action, that we could do so without creating unnecessary violence. And it became very clear to me that this work helped people get arrested without violence, that it helped people stay alive during the winter by keeping things cool. And that all those things proceeded well. Of course, there ended up being arrests, but they were able to get these things without harm, I think is what I would say, and doing shuttle diplomacy work there. In another situation in a police department, what I would share was, it was a case where a civil rights leader and a police chief had made an agreement on how to handle transparency issues around videos of what had happened. There was some mistreatment of someone who had been held by the police. and they'd come to an agreement. What happens is the civil rights leader then goes right to the front of the police station, cameras there, and he blasts the police chief. After they'd come to an agreement behind closed door, the chief was so angry with the civil rights leader. And this was preventing them from getting important agreements that they were about to make. And these guys are big egos, right? They have big egos. And yet what I think I actually went down to this town, into the city, met with them individually, and they both understood that they needed to work things out, but there is so much animosity. It was talking to them individually. It was actually coaching them so that because I was there, I was able to bring them together in the same room. They were refusing to sort of even be in the same room. And having the civil rights leader basically say, here's why I did it. Here's what I feel bad about. It was not easy to make that happen, let me just say, but that made a huge difference to then they're being able to move forward. I mean, it's just, working those sort of, this goes back to what I learned from the Harvard Negotiation Project as to what I could then apply in a situation like this.
How did you make it happen? How did you persuade those people to maybe apologize or show or humility? What did you do?
It was, I think, being able to talk to them and listen to them makes a difference, right? I think they both understood the need to come together. I think having a third party broker it helped. Listening to the venting and then mirroring back at some level. I get it. I see what you're getting at. The one thing I do remember was I had coached one person to raise an issue. He wasn't raising it, so I had to raise it still but it was doing it not in public. It was doing it with the two of them privately first versus having all the lieutenants and having everybody else sort of in there as well. So, we've all been, we're all human. We've all been in situations like that. I get that situation with, my family members, right, or my good friends. So I think the lessons we learn from our difficult. We all run into difficult situations, and it's the ability to be listened to be heard, and then to be what I call it is sort of, can I find a way to be on the same page with that person, and can I just shift that person slightly with my next comment, right? And if I'm thinking at the micro level as a mediator or as a negotiator of how I try to work with someone in a high emotional state here. Never easy, but it's bringing your full self, I think, to it. Sometimes I think we forget that. I'm working on an article with Sarah Cole and with Nancy Rogers about reparations, about truth and reconciliation commissions right now. And, how do we operate as a mediator? How do we operate as a facilitator? Does it mean being neutral in tone and affect, or does it mean being, bringing who you are as a real person to them and having that seen? Because the way I learned mediation, where I am today, is much different than when I started, too many years ago at this point.
So you talk about moving people a little bit with
Mm-hmm.
what you say and what you do.
Yeah.
Give us some practical tips.
Practical tips. Yeah, I mean, so it's made such a huge difference in hostile and difficult situations. I make a point of interviewing every single person who's involved on a one-on-one basis, and it seems like that takes forever. And sometimes, these community disputes involve lots and lots of people, but it does make to be able to connect individually, to hear them out. And I don't mean just from a relationship standpoint. I actually think intellectually and on a content basis, there's so much complexity in these situations. You're going to learn something if you're really listening to a situation. I'm recalling, and it was a mistake I made. This had nothing this is pre-CRS, where I remember the most difficult situations that I worked in prior to CRS, and in some ways I think still as difficult from the emotional standpoint, was working on school-based situations where there are parents and their kids involved. There's just a way in which we just go berserk over our kids, right? When we're defending what they do. And I remember a situation where some parents were irate that some of the employees were being let go of, and this had to do with race. It had to do with their concerns about these individuals who were paras. They were not teachers. They were like they were parents who had parents of kids who had then graduated. They weren't making a lot of money, but they were like their parents. These were Japanese American kids, and they were letting go of people who were helping with Japanese language, and it was, what would I, there was so much opposition, but going through each and every almost countless number of interviews, you were able to get them to calm down in a way that allowed for real dialogue, and just the ability, I would say, to then share it with the entire group as a whole. We then had I've never seen it where we then have a PTA meeting, a parent teacher association meeting, and nearly seemingly every parent showed up, and then presenting to them, here's what we heard, and sharing multiple sides of it. Their ability to see that we had actually heard them put people at peace in a way that I didn't even think was possible here, and that was both intellectual and relationship based. I thought, and I tried to do that in these sort of situations as much as I've been able to.
So, Grant, what about situations where you're dealing with people where you don't really like? They may be racists, or they may be people who are inclined to think violence is okay, or there may be any number of factors going on where you say, oh my gosh, what kind of people are these? And we're all human, right? So we all may have those reactions to different folks with whom we're dealing. I'm sure you've been in situations like that. How do you deal with people who you may find disagreements to totally reprehensible?
Jeff, that's, I think, a really thoughtful question. Because I think, right, when we talk about what happened in Charlottesville, right, here recently, about 3-4 years ago, and you talk about the Proud Boys, and you talk about why would anyone want to negotiate with these people? Like why they are morally reprehensible or something, whatever the thought would be, and that's something, right? I mentioned the Skokie situation. Nobody wanted to talk to Frank Collin, the head of the American Nazi organization. The fact that, and what is interesting, I would note, what was interesting in that situation is the attorney for Frank Collin, the ACLU attorney, was Dick Goldberger, he was Jewish, and he was defending this Nazi and was getting death threats too. The mediator was Dick Salem, who was also Jewish. Frank Collin himself was Jewish. The Nazi leader was actually the child of Jewish parents as well. So but at the same time, there were all these Jewish civil rights groups who were like not going to talk to these people and all that. What I think is important, I think, Jeff, you make me think of an incredibly important point for this work, this type of work, when you're dealing with folks like this, is what is the goal of the work, right? Is the goal the goal is not to agree. The goal is not to compromise on values. The goal as a mediator is not to say, I'm going to agree with you here. That's not the goal. And so therefore, I think I keep that in mind, because these might be people who are opposed to me, who think of me as being the person they're trying to get rid of, right? Here, right? I remember a couple things. I remember sending mediators to work with like KKK groups, and we sent someone and it was up to him to whether he went, who was Black. But it was he then worked with white nationalist groups on, and this is, a few years back, right? This is now 10 years ago, when there wasn't that resurgence yet of these white nationalist groups. He agreed to do it because he thought it was important to, and in those days, the white nationalist groups were often outnumbered by counter protesters dramatically. It probably would be, and so that was the greater fear. And he helped this group. I remember him working with this group, and later on, when he saw him at a different protest, this was in Arizona, he thanked him, and then he would go off and spew his anti-Black hate, onward, right? And I'm not saying everyone should do that, but I am saying there's a benefit if the job is to prevent harm, and the job is to keep people safe. Then I'm okay with it personally. Then I'm personally okay with doing so. I think there's a sanctity, a sanctity of life, or a belief in that as being important, and also secondarily, and a belief in the First Amendment right to free speech, a belief of the importance of that principle as well, that I think CRS has worked hard to uphold, that I believe in as well in doing this work. That question was actually asked of me when I interviewed, would I be willing to do this? So so it is, and there are people who don't want to do it. I think I think that's okay. I think that's fine. I definitely know folks who say, I don't want to be in a room with these sort of folks. But I do think there's importance to doing it for the reasons of safety, of the valuing of life, and for a belief in the principle of the First Amendment.
Have there been times, Grande, when your own racial and ethnic identity made a difference, either made you more effective or less effective as a mediator?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question, because as you could tell from that picture that I shared of CRS, it's maybe one of the most diverse agencies in the whole federal government. It wasn't just tokenism, right? We definitely had we were pretty even when it came to white, Black, Latino, and Asian. I mean, it was fairly, and then we definitely have folks who are of Middle Eastern background. We have folks from Sikh and Muslim backgrounds as well. And we think about that when we send teams out and as well. And I was often certainly the only Asian person in the room in many of these situations that I talked about. I think it leads to some surprise at times, or it leads to folks to like, oh, this is different, right? And I work on a lot of law enforcement, minority relations issues. I still do, and I still sometimes the only Asian person in the room. I think it may superficially, I would say at least, it makes folks think a little more broadly about it, at least some surprise, and maybe that leads to a little bit of openness. But at the same time, what I often think about on this issue is what matters is that what becomes clear the moment I open my mouth, or the moment we get in deep in discussion, is, do I know my stuff? Have I worked with I've worked with individuals from these communities before? What has helped me personally is that I have a large network of people who I've worked with who are from these communities, and I actually often will know people they know, and that is important. And it becomes clear in how we talk about the issues whether I'm culturally competent or not. And it's true for anyone who goes into this work. There's someone who's Latino who shows up in a Black neighborhood. It becomes pretty obvious whether he really understands the issues and the culture of that neighborhood, right? We talk about code switching, and I think mediation sometimes is a lot of code switching. It is being able to work with a lot of, and I think the success of people who do this kind of work are people who can deal with white male conservative police chiefs, and who can work with protesters who are young and Black, right? It is the ability to have credibility when you speak with them here. So I think experience matters. I think diversity matters because there is a representation issue, right? I can't be sending to all these mediations an all-white team, right? That would just kind of be ridiculous, I think, too, at another level. So I'm appreciative in the way that I show up, that I can also bring in other issues, and I'll certainly bring in Asian American issues, but I'll certainly bring in, as we go to we're struggling as a country as we move to a multiracial democracy, right? We all know that, but I think when we show up, whatever our backgrounds are, that is, and mediators, I think, play that role. We are trying to help in whatever ways we can move to a place that says, we have the identities we have, and how do we make this situation work better, and how do we make it? But I hope I emphasized enough. It is situation to situation, but it is also, how do we think of the policies as a whole? How do we think of the big picture versus just dealing with a situation in an urgent crisis situation as well?
Grant, thank you so much. Your book is America's Peacemakers.
Oh,
and I think you were going to put a link in.
Let me do that right now. I'd be a bad author if I don't do that.
You don't plug your own book, Grant.
I know. I'm not that good at that yet. I think that hopefully adds to my charm.
Well, we're happy to give you some practice. Happy to give you some practice at it. This was a wonderful educational presentation. Thank you so much. I know that Second Harvest of Silicon Valley will benefit mightily. I know that many of the people on the line will be contributing to Second Harvest Food Bank of Silicon Valley, or another food bank in their area, in your honor. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing everybody next Thursday. Grant, thank you so much. Natalie, Sarah, and Jean, thank you very much. With that, we are complete.
Thank you.